All right, we're back. It's another Carolina podcast, and football things are happening on the University of South Carolina's campus. Earlier this week, on Monday, players started reporting, and they will continue to do so through the weekend before voluntary workouts start on June 8th. So for all the weirdness, for the fact that we're still in quarantine, and the three of us are in all different locations again, and still the football part of thing is starting to get back to normal. We kind of teased that out a little bit last week, but now it's starting to feel even more like a reality because, again, players are getting back to campus, and we'll start to get updates, and I'm sure hear from some more of the players, some more of the coaches in terms of how that early part of the procedure is going because players are being tested. My understanding is as soon as they get back on campus, but I will get Wes and Chris to go into a little more detail on what bringing players back to campus exactly looks like. But I want to start today with a little bit of recruiting because there's not a ton to get to. It will be mostly kind of off-season, training campy, workouty, hypothetical question-y kind of football talk today, which is fun. I think it will be a much needed, much welcome actual football conversation. But Wes, I do want to start today. You mentioned there are just a couple of tidbits on the recruiting trail that you wanted to mention before we get into some of the other football talk today. So I will let you kick things off with that.
Yeah, I would say maybe just the biggest one, the one worth mentioning for me would be George Wilson, who I think is a name for people to know, sort of a pass rush, edge rush, buck prospect. If you're talking about South Carolina's scheme, recently came out with the top 4, South Carolina making the cut. And really someone, if you look at sort of how their board has shifted, either with their continual evaluation process or with guys, Zaire Patterson picking, Clemson and stuff like that. I think George Wilson has sort of emerged as somebody to keep an eye on, is a guy out of Virginia. We've seen South Carolina, land Bryce Still out of Virginia earlier in the class, and actually are targeting a couple of other high priority guys there as well. And so George Wilson, someone I think is pretty high on South Carolina. Chris, I don't know if you have the top 4 right in front of you. I know South Carolina and Penn State are 2 of them, and 2 schools that we've, at least I've heard, or we're sort of keeping an eye on there. Chris, who were the other 2 that made the top 4?
It's Arizona State and North Carolina are the other 2.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was Arizona State. And North Carolina sort of jumping in. They weren't in the top 7. But had offered him, after he had released his top 7. So 3 teams from the original top 7 make the cut, and then North Carolina gets added in there as well. I think he's got a good relationship with their coaches too. I think another example of Kyle Krantz, if you want to go big picture a little bit with this news, Kyle Krantz has really done a good job of digging in and building some relationships, I think, in his North Carolina and Virginia territories. And I think you're sort of seeing that pay off with a guy like George Wilson, who, like I said, has really, I think, Chris, emerged as a priority guy.
Yeah, he's someone that, like you said, Wes Krantz, he's really done some good work the past couple cycles, whether it's just building relationships with kids or last summer. He had a lot of kids from that Virginia and that DMV area, particularly in Virginia. He had a lot of them on campus last summer. Now, some of them are guys that South Carolina just for a variety of reasons it's not going to gain traction with. But he got a lot of them on campus, and that's really the key. How many guys can you get on campus early to come visit you and get in the game with? And so Wilson's a guy that he's been building a relationship with. And Wilson has spoken highly of Mike Peterson and Krantz, his area recruiter, and Peterson, who's his potential position coach, and guy who's got some explosiveness, and a guy that South Carolina, I think's gained a little traction with. And he falls into that category of, again, when is he going to decide? I think all that plays into it, nowadays in terms of timing of just when he wants to make a decision. But I think South Carolina is certainly one of the programs that has caught his eye, and that's evidenced by them being in that Final Four.
I can't remember if we mentioned this on the podcast last week because I don't know if it happened. I don't remember when last week it happened, but worth pointing out, and the implications of this, I guess, are sort of uncertain as everything has been during this moratorium, this COVID-19 shutdown-induced moratorium, but the recruiting moratorium from college football I guess like as an edict from the NCAA, has been extended through the end of July. Now, Chris, I don't know what kind of a difference that makes, because I think teams were already going to start to, not that they aren't going to focus on the recruiting trail, because you're recruiting 24/7, 365 is kind of how I understand it now. But with teams bringing players back to campus and focusing more on the team that they actually have, does extending that moratorium to July 31st make a big difference to you?
No, probably not. I think really that was the expectation with how everything's gone. I think we talked about this some last week and really many weeks here on the pod, is that a lot of folks thought when this thing hit in March and recruiting got shut down, that if it continued this way, that there was a strong possibility that we may not have in-person recruiting until later in the season. That's probably where it's going. Now, maybe they say, maybe at the end of July, I'm sort of wrong, and they go, hey, we're going to open it back up. But I think coaches, in particular, were keen on the idea of, if we're shutting down recruiting for the summer, let's just keep it that way for a while, because they are getting their players back. And it's a really unique time. Some schools didn't have any spring practice. Some, like South Carolina, had a little bit of it, a third of it. And now everything's sort of accelerated, trying to get back everybody on the right track. So if you add, hey, now we got all these recruits wanting to come to campus for official visits, it makes it more difficult. On top of that, you've got the whole figuring out the logistics of it. Just talk about the current situation. Is it safe to bring guys from all sorts of different places? We hit on some of that last week, so that's another reason. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's already typically a 1-month dead period built into the regular recruiting calendar from the end of June to the end of July. That was put into place when they shifted around the recruiting rules and calendar a couple or a few years ago, when they allowed spring and summer official visits, for instance. They added those a couple of years ago, and they put in that new dead period at the end of summer to sort of give everybody a break. And so even though there hasn't been any in-person recruiting, I'm not surprised that it's stuck, and that they've kept, the dead period going for all those reasons. And I really don't think it's going to be significant right now, because number one, people are already used to that. Number two, you got your team on campus. They'll just continue doing everything remotely. And again, especially for South Carolina, it's all about getting guys on campus this season. I mean, that's really what's going to be key for them.
Yeah, and I guess we'll get a little clearer picture of what the campus atmosphere looks like in the next couple weeks, once we have basically a full body of tests from players, from coaches, from medical staff and training staff, and people that are getting back to campus that will, I guess, give us a better idea of when it will be safe, if it will be safe, and things like that. But from a little bit of recruiting, and from George Wilson and the recruiting trail to South Carolina's current team, and to Rod Wilson, new assistant coach, who spoke with media for the first time via Zoom on Monday. Chris, we'll stick with you for this. What were your impressions of Rod Wilson's initial comments?
Well, I think that's a loaded question. I mean, he talked about a lot of different things, whether it was some of the social justice stuff and how he's sort of helping his players, to, giving some thoughts on transitioning back to South Carolina, some of his background, talking about Mo Kaba, to sort of go in order on those. Rod Wilson, look, he is a really sharp guy, and everybody who knows him on a personal level or, a coaching level, we've said this before, Wes has heard much of the same. I mean, they rave about the guy. He's just extremely intelligent. And he's someone that I think is going to connect with players really well, because, he's a guy from South Carolina. He played high school ball at Cross, still knows a lot of people from this area and has a lot of connections. He played in the SEC. He played at a high level in the NFL for several years, and then he just captured a Super Bowl ring with the Kansas City Chiefs and coached under Andy Reid. And it's someone that a lot of people think is poised to move up, continue moving up in the profession. So I think, given all that, I think he's going to be a sounding board and build some really good relationships with players. So with some of the stuff going on with how some of the players feel, whether they've said it behind the scenes or whether they've said it and been, made their voices heard on social media, that's something he talked about a lot. And just, hey, if the players have a voice, we want them to use it, and I'll be here for them. And then, just going back to the team, I think he joked that he got here and a lot of the players knew the defense better than he did. This isn't a guy that's, coached for Will Muschamp before. He's interviewed with him back in the day. obviously a sharp guy, going to pick some things up. But it's a transition for him, going from, he's been a linebackers coach at Charleston Southern, and he's played the position. He's very familiar with it. But just transitioning to that, and then talking about some of the guys, that they already have on campus. He seems pleased with what they have in the room and pleased with how Mo Kaba's come, along in his rehab. So thought it was interesting, just both from an on-field and off-field perspective.
There's so many variables to juggle, and you're right. I kind of did throw a loaded question at you there because of everything that's going on around the country, and that's not even factoring in, at least most of the conversation this week has not even been factoring in what COVID-19 has done to this country in terms of the shutdown, in terms of creating restlessness and anxiety and things like that within the general population. And I'll be very curious to hear from the players what their response has been to all of this. And I imagine, and Wes, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to talk to anybody or just anybody close to the team, inside the locker room, players themselves or anything like that, just about what it is like to come back. Because on the one hand, I'm sure there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how is it going to be handled? What if one of my teammates has COVID-19? What are the socio-political conversations going to be like in the locker room? But on the other hand, I'm sure there's a sense of relief and an opportunity for a lot of these guys that are close and have been going to battle, as they say, for the last couple years, and to sort of get back to somewhere where they can focus on, I don't want to say a distraction, because I don't even know if we need to be distracted right now, because a lot of the issues at hand are really important and need to be discussed, and we don't necessarily need to distract ourselves from, but just to have something to kind of to unify a bunch of people, on this football team that are from different backgrounds, to come together and say, hey, you're from this area, I'm from this area, you grew up poor, I grew up rich, you grew up poor, whatever the case is, but we're going to get together and we want to beat Coastal Carolina, and then we want to beat East Carolina, and then we want to beat Missouri, and then we want to beat Kentucky, and then we want to beat Georgia or whoever's up next. And again, not to mention that they've all been stuck at home. They've all been, they haven't been able to practice. They haven't been able to, work out like they're used to doing. I imagine there's some sense of relief and appreciation that they can get back to this environment that I think they all love.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for the guys as far as their thoughts on what's going on in our country right now, from a social justice standpoint. But I will say, I've always thought that, there was no better example or very few better examples you could probably find than the way that a team, as you said, can sort of come together, and the fact that a team is from all different backgrounds and nationalities and races and, political affiliations and parts of the country. And like you said, some people may have money, some people may not, but just the ability for a team to come together in a locker room, and even the ability for a team to fight and disagree, but then still turn around and, have that guy's back, even if you may disagree on, a particular issue or, and sort of fight it out and then come to a mutual understanding of respect and stuff like that. I think has always been pretty special and something that I would imagine the guys are anxious to get back and be with their teammates and sort of find common ground and discuss a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world right now. From a COVID standpoint, certainly the last maybe month or so, just from that perspective, I've talked to numerous people who, are close to players that just were really, I think, at that point where they're frustrated with not, being able to be around their teammates, frustrated with not being able to, do what they love. I mean, football is really just a way of life for these guys because, yeah, you play 13, 14, 15 if you're lucky games a year. And, the vast majority of the rest of your time is preparing to be ready for those moments. So throw in the fact that it was a disappointing season for South Carolina, just from a sports standpoint and just the team, camaraderie, just being around your guys. I think there was some frustration, but then some excitement about getting back. And, actually getting back is there's a process to it. I imagine some of the guys maybe feel like it's a little bit overkill. And then I imagine there's a lot of parents out there who are very, very thankful that the schools are going to such great lengths to make sure that this is safe for the guys to come back. I was actually watching Shiloh Sanders' Instagram story, I guess it was yesterday, and he was actually doing the COVID test. I will say this, sort of matches what I've heard about it. Does not look like fun at all. But
scrape your brain with a pair of tweezers, right?
Yeah, a necessary part of all this. And to your point, I know I'm talking really long here, but there's a lot to digest right now and a lot to, we're not in a Twitter world right now. It's hard to express everything that's going on in 140 or 280 characters. There's a lot of nuance to everything that's going on in the world right now from every standpoint. But from a COVID standpoint, I think, like you said, what does it mean if a guy has it? We've already seen an Oklahoma State player tested positive. As many people as we now know are more than likely asymptomatic. If you bring 100 guys back into the program all at once, statistically, someone's going to have it. They probably don't even know it, but I imagine somebody from just about every team, my guess, is probably going to test positive, right?
Yeah, probably. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it's just a matter, is it asymptomatic, in which case, I don't know what the protocol is there because there are other guys on the team that maybe wouldn't be asymptomatic, so I guess you still have to quarantine them, but that's a more complicated issue. And I imagine by the time the voluntary workouts start Monday, by the time the full team has reported, because I guess everybody's reporting. I don't know of anybody that's not reporting, and you can correct me if there are people that are planning to not make it to campus till later in the summer for one reason or another. But I imagine we will have heard about it. We just heard about Frank Martin, who found out in early May that he had COVID-19. Now, he's made a complete recovery. He did not have to be hospitalized, but we're going to hear these things, whether it's a coach, whether it's players. We're going to hear these things, and we're going to get an idea of what that protocol is like. But in the meantime, Chris, as we mentioned, players getting back to campus, I don't know what percentage is there right now, but we do know, well, I just know this because I do a radio show with Eric Kimmery on 107.5 The Game, that Jordan Burch is on campus right now, which means he at least will be at South Carolina for this year. There's no chance that he's going to go to Georgia or LSU or Clemson or anywhere else. He is on campus. What reports have you heard from guys just sort of getting back, moving back in, and starting to think about football?
Well, we haven't heard a lot so far because there hasn't been, not to dodge your question, but there hasn't been a lot of time. I mean, June 1st was the first day that guys could start getting back in. Obviously, South Carolina's going to have some guys rolling in from, the guys who did not enroll early from the 2020 class. Some of them, like Jaquandre Wright, for instance, will not be in June, and we're still sort of gathering up some information on who's definitely on campus, who's definitely, going to be waiting. But Burch is one of those guys. And look, obviously, it's going to be a little bit challenging, just with some of the stuff going on. It's going to be a little bit different. But right now, it's sort of voluntary workouts right now. So it's players doing stuff on their own. Haven't been a lot of detailed reports yet. There just being a few days of guys being on campus and everything and beginning those. And I would imagine we'll begin to hear a little bit more, during the summer. And then once we get a better picture of, the full team coming together and what that looks like as far as training camp and all that, obviously that'll all be later in the year. But, Burch is someone that I think they have high expectations for. It's going to be, there's a transition for anybody, any freshman. You go from high school ball to high-level SEC football. You're playing against grown men, but Burch has a lot of athleticism, and I think he's a guy that I expect we'll hear a lot about just in terms of, wow, this guy is a really high-level athlete. I think we're going to begin hearing a lot of that sooner than later, sort of like we heard with some of the newcomers. Back in January, we heard a lot about Marshawn Lloyd and Luke Doty, for instance, and a lot of that had to do with just their mentality as well, but also some of the things they could do athletically.
When we record this podcast, I guess this time next week, we're recording this Wednesday morning, we will have had, I guess, a couple days of voluntary workouts. So, again, we may have a clearer picture in terms of what it looks like with everybody back on campus, what exactly the workouts sort of look like. But from what you've gleaned at this point, Wes, just reports that we've gotten from the school and conversations you've had behind the scenes, we know there's going to be sort of a pod protocol and we know a little bit about what Paul Jackson wants to do with the guys, I think philosophically in terms of his sprint work and things like that. But what, I guess just generally, does the next month or so of these voluntary workouts look for South Carolina? And does it look different than the voluntary workouts would have looked in years past?
Yeah, I would imagine, and this really isn't something, I'll preface it, that I've specifically been told, but just from, picking up some things here and there and just from my personal knowledge, I think this is going to be a situation where there's a little bit more of a reacclimation process just because, one thing we've heard, I believe, from multiple coaches is that just a realistic expectation that, hey, these guys aren't going to all come back in perfectly good football shape. It's just impossible to expect that. And the good thing about them being back already is that, it's not the middle of July, which was sort of when all this started. That was the date that Will Muschamp sort of threw out there, hey, it's going to take 8 weeks. That's 4 weeks of training and then 4 weeks of actual football preparation to have any semblance of a successful football team on the field. Well, guess what? You really can sort of look at June now as being that 4 weeks of reacclimation, and then you still have an entire month of July, I think, to sort of ramp things up, and then that would be before even you did preseason in August. So, I think it's going to be, I would imagine, very similar. Obviously, from a protocol standpoint, there's going to be a little more structure, I would think, as far as keeping guys maybe a little bit more separated. There are protocols about the amount of space you need to have per player that are in a facility at any one given time while they're working out. So those protocols will be followed. But from a just actual programming standpoint, as far as what they're doing, I would imagine you're just trying to make sure everybody safely gets reacclimated while also pushing them. I think there's a certain aspect of conditioning that's going to suck. Mm-hmm. There's going to be some hurting. Everybody, that goes throughout the entire population. Everybody that's sort of returning to the gym now from quarantine knows what that feels like, and it's probably about times 10 for some of these players because they're being pushed to a limit that the rest of us aren't. But, yeah, I would imagine lots of that sprint work, lots of conditioning, but trying to build back strength is a part of it too, because it's statistically proven. The second you stop lifting, within a couple of weeks you start to lose some strength. So that will be a big part of it as well. And the guys that have been able to keep up at home and maintain at home, those are the guys that are going to have a little bit of a leg up.
Yeah, I think I'm about the same weight as when quarantine started, but I've definitely lost about 5 pounds of muscle and added 5 pounds of fat. So, fortunately, I don't have to get it back necessarily for the start of football season like these guys do. But it's not going to be fun once I do finally get back in the gym. As a quick aside,
that's not
Wes,
the direction you're supposed to be going on. Trading fat and muscle.
No, I know. Well, okay, so it's obviously there's the good and the bad. The good is I haven't gained any weight exactly. I think it's just, and I don't know that it's hard to say exactly, but I imagine the composition of my body has been altered slightly. I got some dumbbells at home. I've been doing it a little bit, but not consistently, and not the kind of stuff that I was doing before. So I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's just what it feels like. Have you gotten back into the gym or anything yet? Because I know you take a lot of group classes, which I had started to do a little bit before quarantine started too, and those are great. But have you still just been working out at home, Wes?
No, I've started going back.
Okay,
I went twice last week. I'm sort of doing a mix right now. I used to do basically 5 classes a week, sometimes 6. I'm not quite sort of at that point. I'm going to do 2 or 3 classes a week, then go running once a week, maybe do some stuff at home once a week, and sort of just ease my way back in. But yeah, it's and even just regular gyms, there's protocols in place. I go to Move Fitness. I'm taking classes, but it's there's X's on the floor. You have to stay spread out. You have to clean down your area after every little. It's separated up into rounds, 10 or 12 minute rounds, and after every round, if you've used a piece of equipment or a dumbbell or whatever, kettlebell, you have to wipe it down. So, it's just it's an adjustment for everybody.
Chris, I've had a lot of numbers thrown at me. A lot of people have. Maybe you listening have retained it better than I have. But can you just walk me through a vague outline, a calendar of what's going to happen over the next couple months for South Carolina? Because we know there's some voluntary workouts. We know there's some talk of an OTA-style training camp. Obviously, there is a sort of regular expected, if everything goes according to plan, if there's not like a massive outbreak on campus or anything like that, then you imagine that the preseason camp would start in the beginning of August like it normally does. The players will have already reported, so I don't know how much that changes. But what's your understanding of the general calendar right now for the football team?
Well, those are really the two things that we know. We know that the June 1st date, and we know the June 8th sort of reopening of the facilities in general date. And beyond that, the next two biggest questions are, okay, what about sort of the preparations in earnest, if you want to call it that, for the season, although obviously what's going on right now is very important. This is voluntary stuff, so far in terms of the workouts, which is not, look, that's not atypical. That's what's going on at this time of summer anyway.
Right, and it's also not exactly voluntary, right?
Well, I mean, that's always the joke.
It's voluntary unless you want to play.
Yeah, right. And look, that is a good point, and I will also say that if you have not been working out in the summer, that generally shows up, later when you get to training camp. I mean, you can tell who's been working out and who hasn't, and I think colleges generally have their finger on the pulse of that anyway, but by rule, it's voluntary. But I think the two biggest questions are this: number one, recruiting calendar, what are they going to do with that? But that's not really what we're focused on today. Number two, how are they going to prepare? And so, we've heard the models still going around, about a particular amount of, team workouts plus, an OTA type thing plus training camp. And the presumption is that training camp won't be a month long this year, like it typically is, but we just don't know that yet. And I really don't know when we'll have a better sense. I think it's touch and go. And so everybody's going to continue going through it and, just sort of take it as it comes. And I think, after a couple or a few weeks of team workouts, the voluntary stuff, maybe they have a better sense. But I haven't heard an updated timeline as to when they'll release all that.
So all that's still completely up in the air. But is there a maximum number of practices that they are allowed to have, like with the spring?
With the new models, you mean?
Well, no, I mean, just in general. Like, you're obviously only allowed to have 15 spring practices. Yeah. One of those is, kind of the quote-unquote spring game. But in terms of the fall camp, could they go through voluntary workouts and then decide in July they want to start training camp? Or could they, wait until the middle of August to do training camp and have the rest of it be, again, like this OTA-style workout that we're hearing about? Or are there any regulations in place, or is it all just going to be, we'll wait and see?
Yeah, I think, for right now, it's all wait and see because, you sort of throw it out the window right now. I mean, what you typically have is you have a calendar, in the bylaws of certain things and in the within the rules of what you can do and when you can do it and how much of it you can do. Just as far as players can do a certain amount of things a week, et cetera, certain number of hours, accountable, athletic activities, and then they can do this on their own. There's a certain amount of film. I think right now you sort of throw that out and they're running all these different models. I highly doubt they would transition from voluntary workouts in the month of June and then say, all right, training camp for a month or 2 months. I think it's going to be, some combo of a team workout thing and then leading into some type of practice. Will some of that be sort of dialed down a bit to an OTA style thing leading into training camp? Maybe so. I mean, that's what a lot of the models are that have been floated behind the scenes, but we just don't have a great sense quite yet of what they're going to, finalize.
Well, as soon as we get a clearer picture, or I should say as soon as you two get a clearer picture, you'll have it on your Twitter feeds on GamecockCentral.com. We'll talk about it right here on the podcast. Wes and Chris, again, great follows on Twitter at GC Chris Clark and at Wes Mitchell GC. I got that down. I used to mix that up all the time, but that's it. And, of course, read everything they do on GamecockCentral.com. Whatever updates we get, Wes and Chris will have it up on the website before we get a chance to talk about it on the podcast. But, of course, we can be expansive on the podcast and we can, cut up and do things like that. So please keep tuning into the podcast as well. Rate, review, and subscribe to that because it's free and it's just a great way to support it. All right, as we move from one version of talking about football abstractly to another. Thank you, Wes and Chris, for both putting up a mailbag thread on the Insiders Forum on GamecockCentral.com. By the way, another reason you should subscribe to GamecockCentral.com so that when we do these mailbag threads, you can get your questions in there, because this is the Insiders Forum, and you do have to be an insider. And I guess just to make up for not doing this a lot in the last couple weeks, like I said, y'all both posted threads, and I got a lot of good questions from both of them. We will start with Chris's thread, and we'll start with Flatwood Cock. Hey, Chris, during Spurrier's last few years, other schools were using his age as a way to give recruits something to think about or lean towards their school, but it doesn't seem to affect Mac Brown at North Carolina. Interesting. Flatwood Cock, that's not exactly a question, but I appreciate the prompt. Chris, are people just not negative recruiting Mac Brown that way, or has he mastered the counterpunch to, hey, he's old, don't go there?
Well, there's a key difference there. And the key difference for Spurrier, I mean, look, when Spurrier got to South Carolina, he was not, extremely young, right? And so at the outset of when Spurrier got to South Carolina, you heard the typical things, that you hear about South Carolina on the recruiting trail. And then you heard, he won't be there long, et cetera. And you got to remember, Spurrier's first few years, they definitely did some good things, beat Tennessee and Nayland, beat Florida. They did some good things, but it's not like they were tearing it up. They weren't on that run that they had from 2010 to 2013 yet. And so you started to hear a lot of that stuff. He's going to go take another job. He's getting older, whatever. Towards the end, what killed South Carolina was not even Spurrier's age. It was, the product slipped a little bit, and then you had the 2 to 3 years comment. That was the killer, and that was when people pounced. With Mac Brown, a lot of people, and I'll include myself in this, are wondering, is this going to work at North Carolina? So the key for them last year was the fact that he hired a staff full of recruiters. He's really honed in, and which he's always done on trying to recruit. He's really focused on that. But they actually had a solid year last year, beating South Carolina in game one and then going on and having a much better than expected year gave them some traction to sign, a pretty quality class last year and then go out and establish some momentum. Had they gone out and won 3 games last year or something, then all it is an older coach who's not winning. So it was important for them to go out and win early. Does it come up at some point? Probably so. But I think that there's a couple key differences there that sort of highlight the contrast to me.
It's a good answer. And I mean, if you look, they have some momentum right now, and they're sort of selling that, hey, Mac's re-energized and Mac's not going anywhere and all this stuff. And they're the funny thing is, they're probably maybe negative recruiting against some other schools right now because they've got it going on over there. And I think you always, I believe, have a little bit of a boost in recruiting when there's a new staff because haven't really lost many games yet. Every staff, there's a honeymoon period where you're selling hope because you haven't been exposed yet. And that can go for almost any staff. And I'm not saying those guys are going to get exposed. I'm just saying in general. They've got a group full of recruiters. It's really a combination of a lot of things. The group full of recruiters, it's a very talented in-state class in North Carolina. Mac has long-standing relationships in that state that date back to when he was an assistant, in North Carolina. And, frankly, everything I've heard, when they got in, they really prioritized this 2021 class, which they were juniors when when Mac and those guys got in. So when they went ahead and prioritized this junior class last year, it's paying off for them right now as the kids are becoming seniors.
Thanks for that prompt, Flatwood Cock. That was a good one. Next from Sir Spur 12216. He says, I know Joe Cox became the wide receiver coach late in the 2020 season, but do you think he can be a good/elite level recruiter and bring in some top talent going forward in 2021 and beyond? And I will add to Sir Spur's question here, just a kind of a personal curiosity and a bigger picture question related to what he's asking. How did each of you, Chris and then Wes, assess young recruiters? Because y'all talk to a lot of people, y'all know a lot of people. how do you know and how do you predict? Because it seems like you know when it's like, oh yeah, I talked to this guy. Right now he's a low-level assistant at a group of 5 school, but I think he's going to be a really good coach. Think he's going to be a really good recruiter. What are kind of the things that you look for, and does Joe Cox have some of those characteristics, Chris?
Well, I think there's 2 main things. Number one, you look at who he's landed, right? And that can be deceiving. And I'll go into that in 1 second, why I think that. And then number 2, I think you talk to people about him, who know him, whether it's prospects, high school coaches, just other people in the industry, and try to get a sense of what type of recruiter he is. So the first part of just who he landed, I think in some cases we've seen guys, have tremendous success recruiting somewhere like Alabama or whatever. Then they get to South Carolina and you go, wait a minute, what's going on here? It's like the Travolta gif where he was walking into a room and like looking around, like, where's all the recruits, and so like that, there is some of that, but I think you have to keep in mind, where people are at in the circumstances. Like South Carolina's recruiting class this year is probably not going to be as highly ranked, and there's a lot of factors in that. So, if Joe Cox doesn't sign 5 4-star wide receivers this year, you don't go, oh, he's not a good recruiter. It's a complex thing. Secondly, I think you look at just talking to different people. And so sometimes you can take a look at a guy and what he does on social media. You talk to prospects, and if a lot of them bring up, hey, I have the best relationship with this coach, or this coach is doing a really good job recruiting me. You talk to high school coaches and say, hey, I'm really impressed by this guy. What's his reputation in the industry? I mean, and I've heard a lot of that about Joe Cox. So Joe's a good recruiter. He's going to be a good recruiter. It's all about building relationships. How can you connect with kids and their families? And so I do think Cox has a lot of potential in that regard, just based on what we've heard. And I think you have to go off what you hear from some people that you trust on the matter.
All right, JMH 1395 says, who is going to be the number 3 receiver? In my mind, someone is going to break out between Carrion, Terrell, Van, Ortre, Johnson, Davis. I think Smith and Leggett are 1 and 2. Wes, maybe a more apt question is who's going to break out as the number 1 receiver right now for South Carolina, because I guess it's going to be Shi Smith, but that doesn't necessarily inspire a lot of confidence in me personally. But I guess you can answer JMH 1395's question first.
Yeah, who would be the number 3? My initial instinct was, all right, who's going to be the number 2 receiver at least? I think Shi has the ability to be the number 1 guy, and I think sometimes when guys are sort of just slotted as, hey, you're the number 3 guy, which was the case 2 years ago if you're Shi Smith, or hey, you're the second option, which was the case last year if you're Shi Smith. You sort of fall in line to that expectation. And then when you're expected to be the guy, we've seen time and time again, South Carolina over the years has had wide receivers step up when it was their time to be the dude. I think, I go all the way back to watching Shi at South Carolina's camp when this staff first arrived, and just his dominant performances out there, to some of the things I've heard about what he's done in practice. Have we seen him become a dominant receiver on the field on game days yet? No, but I still think that's in there. I think now with the opportunity to be the guy, he can step into that role. I think I won't say it's wishful thinking, because it's certainly a possibility he steps in as the number 2 guy and is a solid, just go-getter, playmaker type for them. I don't think that's known yet. I don't think that's decided yet. I think that's the hope. I'd say that's probably best case scenario, is that Shi Smith just rolls into that number 1 spot, and then Leggett has a great off season and is sort of the guy. And then I think once you start, if those 2 things happen, then really, like he said, there's any number of options for the 3rd spot. DeCarrion Joyner showed some really impressive, I thought, just natural, instinctive ability at receiver, considering he hasn't played the spot. Last year, does Ortre Smith come back 100% and healthy and sort of finally be able to build off some of the things he did as a true freshman? Josh Van is someone that a lot of people have given up on, but I think that's still a little premature. There's a lot of guys. Rodriguez Davis is like the most forgotten guy on the entire team, I think, and showed some good things as a freshman. way back, in year one of the staff. So there are options there. I know I'm avoiding his question, but my guess, if you sort of say Shai is one and that Leggett is two, I don't know. Me personally, I kind of maybe lean to carry on potentially being the third guy, but that's just my guess and my instinct right now.
That surprises me a little bit because you are, in fact, Wes Mitchell noted Josh Van Believer, which is great, and I mean there are lots of reasons to believe that he could come out of the other side of what was, I guess we can best chalk up as a sophomore slump, and obviously the season ended with injury for him, and expect him to return a little bit more to kind of what people expected out of him coming out of high school and the few flashes that he showed his freshman year as well. But you're going with carry on. Chris, I'll throw the same question at you, and you can just go. I mean, even if you think Xavier's going to be number 3 and one of these guys will be a number 2, but what do you think is the 1, 2, 3 pecking order at the end of the 2020 South Carolina football season?
Yeah, I do think you have to go with, the top 2 guys, some form of Xavier Leggett and Shai Smith. And, another question to me is, what do you sort of count as that number 1 guy? Because I don't know if there's going to be one guy that has, 30 or 40 more catches than the second guy. Maybe. That'd be sort of tough to project. So is it sort of your touchdown leaders, your receptions leader? I think most people normally think of the receptions leader in those terms. But I would probably go with those 2 at number 2. And number 3, I think Wes's pick is pretty good. I'm still going to go with Josh Van. I am, just because, and that really gets people upset sometimes because of the struggle he had last year. But I still am a believer in his upside and his potential, and I think he's shown flashes of that his first couple seasons. And I think if he can become more consistent, the thing is he has the talent to do that, because we've seen it in high school. We've even seen flashes in college. So I think it's sort of really a toss-up, grab bag type thing for me. But I'd still go with Josh if I had to make a projection. That's all it is.
Owings WJ has a 2-part question here. We will start the first part with Chris. What type of season/contribution do you think Zach Pickens will have this year? Do you think he could have an all-SEC type season?
Good question. I do know this. They're counting on Pickens a lot. Year one, he was a 5-star, and that gave people, I think, unrealistic expectations at times. But he still was able to play some for a defensive line that's pretty good. He was transitioning to being an inside player. He's still working himself into the type of shape and the type of, skill set that you got to have in there. But he got his feet wet a little. All SEC, first team type of expectations, a little rich for me, in year 2. I think he could end up being a guy that, is maybe like a lower, second, third team type all conference would, I think, be, a significant achievement for him, because there's going to be a lot of good players in the SEC. I mean, you think about it, you pick out guys and say, man, that guy's a really, really good player. He may be third team SEC, in a given year. So, but I think he's going to play a lot. Obviously, his role is going to increase. Will he even be a starter for sure? We got to figure that out, because you look up front and some of the guys they've got, I think he's certainly got a really good chance to be, but I don't know if it's a lock. And, how do they play him and Rick Sandage together? Do they play the same position sometimes? But I expect him to have a good, solid season in year 2.
Yeah, I'm not going to say it's good if he's not an all-SEC player by the end of the season. That would be incredible if he is. Rather, I'm not saying it's not better if he's not. But if he's not, I mean, given what we know about the depth that South Carolina has with the defensive line, I think it could be a very realistic scenario that they have like 6 or 7 guys that they're very comfortable with, all those guys playing about 60 snaps a game, and it's a matter of everybody staying fresh and maybe no one person dominating statistically or grabbing all the accolades, but it ends up just being like an incredibly solid group. It would probably be like my more honest prediction for what kind of year that group, and then I guess subsequently the individual guys that comprise that group are going to end up having. Wes, unless you want to follow up on Chris's answer to number 1, I will throw number 2 from Owings WJ at you. He says, outside of Marshawn Lloyd, what incoming freshman do you expect to make the biggest contribution on offense?
Whew. Great question. I think as I buy myself some time here, one of the most interesting things that came out this spring, at least for me, was when Bobo was asked about the offensive identity, and he said, hey, these freshmen are really going to shape the identity of the offense. And for me, generally coaches sort of downplay almost, the impact of true freshmen early on. They want them to earn it, et cetera, et cetera. But for him to basically say, hey, the way our offense looks could really be determined by how well these freshmen adapt and how ready they are to play. I think that all the incoming sort of skill guys, your receivers and tight ends are going to have a chance. I would say Rico Powers. I would say Jakari Caldwell, Jaheim Bell, Eric Shaw. All four of those guys are going to have a chance to come in and play and potentially play a lot. And it may be some recency bias because I just talked to the kid a couple of days ago, but I just have a feeling Jaheim Bell is going to just be a guy that they can't keep off the field. Is he a big wide receiver? Is he a tight end? Does it matter really what you call him? He said that the coaches told him he's going to spend some time in the wide receiver and the tight end room, that he's going to spend some time doing both. I think
so. He might be the answer to the other question about number 3 receiving option.
Could be, man. And I think, I know that the poster was specifically talking about wide receivers, but if we're going to talk about receiving threat, then Nick Muse is probably the number 2 or 3 receiving threat, I think, within this offense. But yeah, I rewatched Jaheim Bell's film from his senior year, and the guy just has a knack for making plays. I mean, you're talking about someone that most people see as a tight end, but was returning kicks. I mean, you just don't really see that athleticism at that position. But the sort of cop-out answer is that all 4 of those guys I mentioned are going to have a chance. They specifically, I know for a fact, they told Jakari Caldwell and Rico Powers, like, be ready. You're going to have a chance to play. I like both those guys. But if you sort of said, hey, give me one guy, it's complete gut feeling. I just got a feeling that Jaheim Bell just has that playmaker vibe to him for me.
All right, well, let me throw a wrench in there and see if this changes your answer. What if instead of incoming freshmen, we just say that anybody that's new to the South Carolina football team, including transfers, including JUCO guys, who do you think then will make the biggest contribution on offense this year?
I still probably go the same direction. Just because if Zaquandre White was already getting on campus, that would change my answer. But I just think the uncertainty there, the fact that we saw it with a guy in Tavian Feaster who had played 3 years at a premier college football program, still had an adjustment coming in late and getting back into football shape and learning the playbook and all those things. Zaquandre White coming in from JUCO, having to get back in football shape, having to sort of learn the scheme as well. I'm really high on him as a player. And you know what? If he's just too good to keep off the field, then all that other stuff, they'll find a way to get him out there. But to me, just from a percentage standpoint, that sort of lowers the chances that Zaquandre White just comes right in and starts pushing, the other guys for the number 2 or even the starting spot, which I think if he had come in the spring, then, he and Marshawn Lloyd are probably battling it out for number 1.
So you're not going with Colin Hill or Adam Prentice, and I was sort of trying to bait you into picking one of those 2 guys.
Oh, yeah, I thought you were baiting me into Zaquandre. But, Prentice is going to be the guy that makes a big impact, but nobody really talks about.
Right.
I don't think he's going to be catching a ton of passes. I don't think he'll be running the football, but we'll be doing the dirty work, up front.
All right, well, that's sort of related to our next question. We may have time for one more after this, but our next question is a lot to unpack. This is from 7 Plagius 7 Cox 7. Chris, how talented can this group of tight ends actually be for USC? Wes touched on that a little bit. Also, how important are the tight ends to Bobo in his offensive scheme as offensive coordinator? How many different ways can they be used in his system? And the same question about fullback or H-back, and is this possibly the most talent ever at quarterback, tight end, and running back? I can't remember a time when all three positions were this deep with talent, both combined as a team in a season nor individually at each position. Can you think of another time when the running back position was this deep with potential talent as a group in a season? Same question for quarterback and tight end. I guess we'll go in order here. Tackle the first part. How talented can this group of tight ends be, and how important are tight ends to what Mike Bobo wants to do? Just combine tight ends, fullbacks, H-backs into just sort of one like big tweener, too big to be a wide receiver, too small to be an offensive lineman.
Well, I think the group can be really talented on the whole. There's no doubt. When you look at like what's on the roster athletically, it's really good. The biggest question is just, will those guys develop as they could, and then experience? So right now it's hard to say, well, this is the best tight end group because there's that unknown. From a talent perspective, it certainly could be, because I think I think Nick Muse is a future NFL guy. I think, Eric Shaw and Jaheim Bell are potential future NFL guys, and even Keyshawn Toney, Trey Kenyon, I like what some of those guys bring to the table. But the issue is they just haven't played a ton. And even Nick Muse, we only saw part of 1 year of what he could do at South Carolina. So the tight ends are important with what Bobo does. He plays them in line some. He obviously can, a guy like Prentice, he can play him as like an H-back or as a fullback. He plays those guys in the slot sometimes. Like I think back to when Bobo had, like a guy like Aaron White and then a guy like Orson Charles at the same time at Georgia. He could put them on the line, both of them. He could split them out, play them in the slot, and it can make it tough for a defense to figure out, what is this guy? Where is he playing? You could shift him around. So it's pretty important. I mean, he'll utilize those guys a lot because, like we've said, he'll utilize sort of a flex type or an inline type, and he does I formation. He does 4 wide looks, and he can deploy 1 or 2 of those guys in the slot.
And as far as the talent at those positions, obviously he singles out quarterback, tight end, and running back, wide receiver, a little bit of a question mark, and we got into that a little bit. At tight end and running back, you can play a bunch of guys there. You can play. Carolina ran a lot of ran a lot of 12 personnel. I know that because it's alphabetical, R first, then T. Ran a lot of 12 personnel last year when they were healthy enough to do so. I imagine they will do that. And you mentioned a guy like Jaheim Bell. It's not Jakeem, it's Jaheim because it's an H, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
A guy like Jaheim Bell, you can put him on the field probably with a couple other tight ends and let him do some other things. So Carolina could feasibly have 2 or 3 tight ends on the field at the same time, which would be great because there's talent. There's a lot of options, and there's a diversity in skill sets there as well that could be important. With the running backs, you can really only have 2 of those guys on the field at the same time realistically, but as we saw last year, it's good just for whoever's in front, for whoever's getting those number 1 carries, to have a lot of other guys there pushing them in practice and training camp, to have options so that you don't have to have one guy having 30 carries a game, so that if somebody gets hurt, even if it's just for a week, you have somebody able to step in. With quarterback, it's a little bit different. It's still good to have that competitive depth in practice, in preseason, and things like that to be pushing whoever's number 1. And undoubtedly, there is a lot of talent in that quarterback room with Ryan Helinski, obviously Luke Doty coming in, and I think making waves in the little bit of the offseason that South Carolina has had so far, just in terms of his leadership ability and physicality and all those things. And of course, you bring in someone in Colin Hill who's played a lot of college football, who is the most familiar with Mike Bobo's offense of anybody other than Adam Prentice on the team right now, and that will certainly be an advantage for him as they all start to learn this new offense. I guess the first part is, when can you remember the last time that all 3 of these position groups were this talented? And 2, like I said, I think it's good for tight ends and running backs. It's not bad for quarterbacks, but how much of a difference does it make to have all those guys in the quarterback room, Wes?
Let me answer the other question first. Because I got it right on my brain. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of talent in these groups, but I think we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit by declaring, the most talent since, whenever. I mean, I look back, let's talk tight ends. Not that long ago, I was trying to think of the overlap on some of these guys. Jarrell Adams, Busta Anderson, Justice Cunningham, that run of tight ends there. Then that gets followed up, obviously by Hayden Hurst coming in and doing what he did at that position. Running backs, there was a time when, Marcus Lattimore, Kenny Miles, who was sort of, never really put in the same conversation, obviously, with Marcus, but was like a solid backup guy. A young Mike Davis and a young Brandon Wilds were all, available in the same backfield. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential at these position groups, but I do think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves as far as to talk about, is this the most talented group? As far as having actually gone out and done it, no, I wouldn't say it is at all. Even quarterbacks, we saw South Carolina go from, if you want to just talk about on paper, Stephen Garcia, comes in, plays a bunch, but then, gives way to Connor Shaw, who, then gives way to Dylan Thompson. How many schools had a backup like Dylan Thompson who could come in at any point and be not just a veteran presence, but go make big-time throws for you, and then ultimately as a senior ends up breaking the single-season, passing record. So I know the poster is trying to, give some positivity, and I think it's warranted. There's talent to work with at those positions, but realistically, I think that's sort of an unintended shot at some of the guys that were here during that run of really, really good play, because there were talented guys, but there was also depth at those positions, and that's part of the reason why South Carolina was so good. When Marcus Lattimore went down, some guys stepped up in his absence. When Connor Shaw was banged up, Dylan Thompson stepped up in his absence. So the tight ends were able to sort of have two guys that could go make plays for you. So I think that's the goal, is to get back to that point. Could it play out that way? Yes, but I don't think it's there yet.
I'm putting on the spot here, and I'm not asking as like a trick or anything. I really have no idea. I couldn't even begin to guess what the number is. But how many guys, I don't know when the Elite 11 camp started, but how many Elite 11 guys has South Carolina had on its team ever?
Oh, goodness.
One given time?
Or no, is it like one? Like Connor Shaw wasn't an Elite 11 guy. I don't think Dylan Thompson was. Connor Mitch may have been, because I know he was highly regarded coming out of high school, right? Like there's some random ones in there. I'm just trying to get an idea, because to have two of them, jockeying for position, and I think there's some people that are close to the team that think Colin Hill is really going to be in the mix. I'm not refuting you, because obviously you're exactly right. All those guys have to go out there and prove themselves. And right now, I think most Carolina fans would rather have Connor Shaw, would rather have Stephen Garcia, would rather have Dylan Thompson as the presumptive starting quarterback, just because for now, those are all known commodities. And right now, Carolina is largely dealing with unknowns at the quarterback position. But just in terms of the talent, I'm wondering if they've ever had two Elite 11 guys in the quarterback room really duking it out for supremacy before.
Do you know, Chris? Brandon McElwain was an elite guy, and but let's see, with Jake graduating early, did that keep him from being able to go to Elite 11? I'm trying to think of the timing.
My answer is I can't come up with it. We'd have to, Pearson, you dropped the question that we'd have to go back and research. Wes and I try to stay on our P's and Q's, but the number of Elite 11 quarterbacks at one time, all time, is not one that I have off the top of my head.
Yeah, sorry, I put you on the spot with that one. But, is the number – well, when was Elite 11 established? Has that been around since the 80s, or is that a relatively new thing?
No, I don't think it's been around.
It's newer, yeah.
Okay, so has Carolina had like 5 of those guys ever? Have they had 25 of those guys? I don't need to know an exact number, but just kind of like ballpark it.
It's lower than it's lower than a 25 number.
Okay, so they've probably had like 10 or fewer.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, all right, cool. So the fact that they have that, again...
and then you have,
okay.
a lot of times people will say, sometimes you get called an Elite 11 quarterback if you get invited to the Elite 11.
As opposed to being one of the, finalists or whatever?
One of the final Elite 11, yeah. Okay. There's the Elite 11 competition, which I think in general has about twice that. So, the Carry-On Joyner got invited to the Elite 11 finals. But then after you go through that process, they whittle it down and they give a true, hey, here's based on what they did at this competition, here are what we believe are the actual top 11 quarterbacks in the country. So, that's sort of a distinction there that kind of gets sort of muddies the water a little bit as well.
Okay. All right. Well, the only reason I bring that up is just to contextualize that, again, Luke Doty could turn out to be a bust, and Ryan Helinski could turn out to be a bust. I don't think that's going to be the case, at least not for both of those guys. But it is, I think, at least a good sign and reason for optimism, which, as you pointed out, Wes, seems to be kind of the guiding principle, or at least the consistent theme throughout this post from, again, 7 Plages 7, Cock 7. It's just hard to say that, but we do appreciate the question. And thanks to everyone that posted a question on the thread. We only got 2 questions from Chris's thread today, so maybe we can revisit a couple that were on Wes's thread and a little bit of a mailbag if we decide to do that again next week. Stay tuned to the Insiders Forum on GamecockCentral.com just in case we put one of those up. We probably will, because next week, like I said, we'll have a little bit of a clearer picture of what these voluntary workouts look like. What's the composition of the team? Do any players have COVID-19? What's happening with the players that do test positive as players continue to trickle back into campus? And whatever else we've heard from coaches, from players from around the team, just regarding the return to campus. So we'll do that. We'll have a little bit of a mailbag. I guess one of these days we're going to get to this Tales to the Trail thing that I am just going to keep teasing in perpetuity. But one day we will have little enough football to talk about that we will have a chance to get to it. But thank you all so much for listening today. Again, thank you so much for all of your questions on Gamecock Central. Subscribe to GamecockCentral.com so that you can get all the updates before the Wednesday pod, and subscribe to the Wednesday pod and everything on the Gamecock Central Podcast Network so that you can listen to us cut up and listen to me put Wes and Chris on the spot for, really unfair, tough questions about really specific things. But in the meantime, thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.